I will focus on the consequence of climate change from the perspective of environmental structure. And with the increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide then goes back to the oceans and acidifies it. And the consequence of this is a change in speciation of carbon. So the relationship between changes of environmental factors is perturbed as a result of the acidification. And this has some profound implications on ecology and adaptation and evolution. And I will present this from the perspective of structured environmental networks, where changes in environmental factors are physical-chemically changing each other in a way that has been seen over evolutionary timescales by organisms and used it as information to adjust their behavior and maximize fitness. And I'll give a perspective of how the structure of environmental changes is mirrored in the networks within cells and across cells in terms of their interactions, and how a change in this interaction between organisms as a result of changes in environmental factor changes is going to have profound implications on organisms that live in the ocean. But there's a silver lining for some organisms that can then rapidly internalize the new structures of their environments and then evolve new behavior, such as novel interactions across species. So the journey for us began with an organism that I've been interested in for the better part of my career, and these are organisms that live in high hypersaline environments. These are characterized by very high salt concentrations approaching saturation, about 3 to 4 molar salinity. And internally, the organisms also have to develop strategies, and they've evolved different kinds of strategy to balance the osmotic pressure. In particular, one organism, Halobacterium, that's on the screen, is an extremophilic archaeal organism which has evolved some very interesting mechanisms to deal with the high salt. And so we've been studying it for a long time. And when Kenya was in the lab, she was looking at the response of this organism to diurnal fluctuations in light in the day-night cycle. And what we saw, to our surprise, was that the entrainment with light-dark cycles resulted in coordination of physiology associated with aerobic and anaerobic metabolism in this organism. And it started living in or expecting or anticipating an anaerobic environment during nighttime and an aerobic environment, aerobic environment at nighttime and anaerobic environment in daytime. And the oscillations could not be explained by an internal clock in this organism because it doesn't have one. It has one gene, Chi-C, which is known to be involved in the clock mechanism along with several other genes in cyanobacteria, but those genes are absent in this organism. So we characterized the systems biology of this behavior, and we were able to find an RNase-mediated switch, which allowed it to switch back and forth between anaerobic and aerobic metabolism. But we couldn't find the underlying reason for why it was able to coordinate this behavior with the day-night cycle. And this explanation came a few years later when Lee and Monica were looking at a different organism and how it interacts with Halobacterium. This organism is Dunaliella. It's a eukaryotic chlorophyte, and it lives in the same environment and is responsible for majority of carbon sequestration that happens in that environment. And it has the same challenges that Halobacterium has, which is high salt that it has to negotiate to be able to survive in that environment. And what it does is interesting. It sequesters the carbon and channels a large proportion of that carbon, sequestered carbon, towards a production of glycerol. And the high amounts of glycerol, which can go up to 7 molar internal concentrations, allows it to counterbalance the osmotic stress. Now, the environments are, because they're characterized by high salt, they are poor in terms of solubility of gases. So the organism runs out of carbon dioxide, and to regenerate its population, it has to come up with some new mechanism to access carbon for sequestration. And what it does is quite interesting. It triggers a programmed cell death event where a large fraction of the population undergoes programmed cell death every night. And it releases a number of different goodies into the environment, and this appears to be a mechanism for recycling the carbon so that it can regenerate new populations. And so if you look at the dynamics of the population over the day-night cycle, what you see is at nighttime, the population crashes because of programmed cell death event, and up to 75% of the population can die off by this mechanism. And the subsequent day, with a couple of cell divisions, it regenerates the population. And the net rate of increase in population is consistent with what is observed in the environment. But what this does is it releases all the nutrients, not just for itself, but also for the organisms it lives with. And one of them is Halobacterium. And as a result, it appears that Halobacterium, over its evolutionary timescales, has taken advantage of it. So every night, Halobacterium pumps up, anticipates the release of nutrients by Dunaliella and prepares for aerobic metabolism, which is its preferred lifestyle. And then it remineralizes the released carbon from the Dunaliella, and it releases back some nutrients, and we suspect it's vitamins that increase the productivity of this organism. So this is an interesting example where you see that the structure of environmental changes, light and temperature and oxygen and so forth, have coordinated physiology not just within Halobacterium, but also structured its interaction in a spatiotemporal manner with a neighboring organism. And these types of environmental structures propagate across scales. So a change in the environmental structure is going to impact one or few organisms, but will have a cascading effect across multiple scales in the environment. So the question is, how would this play out in context of ocean acidification? And with ocean acidification, for the large part of our history, the carbon cycle was in equilibrium between the carbon dioxide that was released and that is being sequestered. But then came in the Industrial Revolution, and we started pumping in 5 to 10 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere each year. And this has eventually resulted in acidification of the ocean. And Steve mentioned in his talk that a large amount of carbon that is sequestered, and about 50% of photosynthesis occurs in the ocean, and half of that is being processed by microbial communities, which is also known as the microbial loop or the biological carbon pump. And these are organisms. You can go to any lake or ocean, you'll see a large number of organisms of different kinds that are living in these organized networks where they are collaborating and competing to process the nutrients that are in the environment. And in this context, we were curious about how the acidification events are going to impact some keystone species in the oceans, and in particular a diatom called Thalassiosauria sudanina, or THAPS for short. And this organism arguably is one of the most important photosynthetic organisms in the oceans. And to understand how it is being impacted in the Puget Sound, Jake built a series of photobioreactors so we could simulate ocean conditions 50 years ago, and current day, and in the future. And we started studying the impact of increased CO2 levels and acidification on the systems biology of this organism. And what we found was when we just looked at the growth patterns of this organism over different carbon levels, there was no appreciable phenotypic difference, but at a molecular level, we saw some striking changes in the metabolism of this organism. And especially what we noted was the carbon concentrating mechanisms were being repressed, because when you have high CO2 levels, the organism doesn't need to concentrate carbon anymore. It can directly use it for photosynthesis. And it got us thinking that this relaxes some constraints on this organism, because it doesn't have to expend energy towards concentrating carbon dioxide. So where could that energy be used instead? Perhaps to deal with stress. So we then did an experiment, and Jake did this really time-consuming and laborious experiment where we put the diatoms in the photobioreactors at different CO2 levels and then progressively hit them with increasing UV radiation. This was to simulate the consequence of shallowing of the mixing layer in the oceans, which will expose the diatoms to higher UV radiation levels. And so at each stage, after a certain period of time, we gave it a dose of UV at around noontime every day, and then progressively increased the dosage. And then we looked at the consequence of this environmental structure on the physiology of the organism. And what we found was that the lower carbon dioxide levels, within a few ramp-ups in UV radiation, the organism reached a tipping point. There was a critical slowing down, and then it collapsed. But when we increase the CO2 levels, because it's not expending energy for concentrating carbon dioxide, it appears to be using that instead to deal with the UV stress and able to sustain that effect and not collapse. So another way of looking at this is as a consequence of growth rate decline, you see that at lower CO2 levels, the organism collapses quite rapidly, but with an increase in CO2 levels, because of ocean acidification, it shifts the tipping point and makes the organism more stable. So it broadens the niche. And the implication of this would be that this organism can now encroach on the niche occupied by other organisms in its environment. And conceptually, it would appear something like this, where the organism is living in a certain level of a certain structure of environment, but when there's acidification, that niche breadth is shifted, becomes much broader, and it encroaches on the niche of another organism, such as cyanobacteria in the open ocean, which is then outcompeted and is shifted over. Now, is there evidence for such dramatic shifts in ecosystems? And I will point to work done by Ginger Armbrust at the university, and she's one of our collaborators, where she saw that the limiting ion conditions in Northeast Pacific Ocean is primarily favoring cyanobacterial populations in the current day conditions. But because of shipping, when iron is leached into the environment, it shifts the whole ecosystem from being primarily cyanobacterial based to diatom based. So it relaxes the constraints on diatoms and allows them to encroach on the territory which is previously occupied by cyanobacteria. So these dramatic shifts will impact not just this one organism, but all the organisms that it's competing with or collaborating with. Now, the question that we asked was, if we consider adaptation and evolution, are there mechanisms by which these organisms can adapt to new environmental structures? How quickly can novel structures be internalized for organisms to adapt in the changing environment? And here we did this work with John Aitchison, who's my colleague here at ISB, where we took yeast and we asked if we can teach yeast to use caffeine as a cue for anticipating some sublethal stress of a toxin. So what we did was we took yeast, and every 10 generations, we gave it some caffeine, and in about 30 minutes, we hit it with a sublethal dose of 5-fluorouric acid. And then we had a neutral phase. So in case they evolved a constitutive mechanism of dealing with FOA stress, there was a penalty. So we did counter selection against constitutive resistance. And then we continued this for many generations. And then every 50 generations, we then evaluated whether it had internalized this new pattern that we were imposing. And the way we did this was at every 0, 50, 200, or 300 generations, we took an aliquot, we either gave it caffeine or did not give it caffeine, and then investigated the susceptibility to 5-FOA. And what you see is with caffeine, after a few generations, in some cases within 50 generations, it is able to anticipate that there's impending toxic stress that is going to be encountered. And we can convert this graph into a ratio of plus caffeine over minus caffeine and get a condition fitness plot. And what this tells you is that when you're below this line, there is no adaptive prediction, which means it can't use caffeine as a cue to anticipate stress. But within 50 generations, in some cases, it evolves this behavior where giving it caffeine prepares it to anticipate a sublethal dose of 5-fluorouric acid. And these are the different formats in which we ran the experiment. First, we took yeast, a clonal population, and then we put it through this whole experiment regimen. And we did many replicates. And across most replicates, we did not see any evolution of adaptive prediction. This is one replicate where we saw some marginal increase in condition fitness. But this is not how natural populations work. They already have enormous genetic heterogeneity. So we said, if we start with a population that has heterogeneity, is there a better chance of evolving this behavior? And so we took wild-type yeast, and we introduced a whole bunch of genetic variations, and then we put it through this experiment schedule. And within about in this example, I'm showing you 150 generations, it evolved this adaptive prediction behavior. In some cases, it did that within 50 generations. And we sequence the populations, we're looking at the mutations, and there's mutations all over the place, and interpreting that is going to take some time. This is ongoing work. But in parallel, we did something cute. We said, okay, why don't we engineer yeast and bring it one step close or one step removed from a solution? So what we did was we took the enzyme that deals with 5-fluorouric acid and put a signal on it. And that signal would target it to peroxisomes if it is phosphorylated. Okay, all yeast had to do was figure out how to use caffeine as a cue to drive that phosphorylation event. So it is conditionally localized into peroxisomes, which gives it protection against the toxin. And when we did that across all replicates, we saw that it consistently, reproducibly evolved the adaptive prediction. And to track what happens to the enzyme, we had also tagged a green fluorescent protein to it so we could see where that enzyme is going. And then we did microscopy and then segmented the microscopy images and assayed the amount of enzyme in the cytoplasm versus the peroxisome. In the 0 generation, when there's no adaptive prediction, you see that primarily most of the enzyme is cytoplasmic. But if you give it caffeine in about 200 generations, so I should point out that with or without caffeine, there's actually no localization towards the peroxisome, which would be to the right. In fact, if anything, it is moving more cytoplasmic and might explain why you have increased toxicity here. Okay. Within 200 generations, we saw that across many populations that had evolved this behavior, yeast had somehow figured out to link the caffeine sensing network to the localization of this enzyme into peroxisomes. And it was shifting it into this organelle and getting resistance as a result of that. Now, this essentially shows that adaptive prediction could emerge very rapidly in populations with genetic heterogeneity, suggesting that when there's new environmental patterns in an organism's niche, it could potentially, some organisms could take advantage of it and internalize that structure quite rapidly. Okay? What happens to interactions? Now, does this type of behavior scale up? So here our question was, if you have a microbial community that is shifted to an environment with new structure, would you have novel types of interactions emerge between different species? And this work we did in collaboration with David Stahl at the University of Washington. And he set up this beautiful synthetic community, simple, but makes the whole process very tractable. You have two organisms, a sulfate-reducing bacterium, which prefers to live by respiring sulfate, but when it encounters a methanogen like Methanococcus meripaludis in an environment where you have no sulfate, it can then complete a reaction to generate energy, and both organisms can live in a syntrophic interaction. Okay? And he evolved these lines, about 12 lines in about 2 different conditions, with and without shaking, and across nearly all of those lines, what he saw was about in 300 generations, the growth characteristics of this community, synthetic community, improved dramatically. In 1,000 generations, we sequenced the populations genome-wide, and we saw that mutations had accumulated all over the place in the genome. And one principal observation was that the lifestyle of living independently, i.e. with sulfate respiration, had eroded. And that makes sense because it didn't need sulfate respiration anymore. So it got rid of this capability quite quickly across multiple lines. A second observation we made was that the regulatory network had accumulated a lot of mutations. And our initial explanation for that was, well, this is a uniform condition in which we're evolving this synthetic community, so regulation must be not as important. And that's why you can get rid of regulation, because you don't have to keep changing things. If that were true, then if we disrupted the regulatory network but required the organism to go back and forth between the independent lifestyle of sulfate respiration or a syntrophic lifestyle with the methanogen, then mutants that are disrupted in the regulatory network should suffer. They shouldn't be able to cope up. So the network of this organism was not known, so we applied a systems biology approach, which I won't talk about today, and identified the regulators that coordinate sulfate respiration with a large number of other genes across the genome. And we deleted all these regulators one at a time and showed that when you transition from a sulfate depleted condition to a replete condition, the fitness of these organisms drops substantially. So our prediction was that now if we take these strains and put them through a alternating lifestyles of sulfate respiration, which is independent, or syntrophy, which is dependent on the methanogen, then these organisms should not be able to survive for too many iterations. But to our surprise, when we did the experiment, the wild type, within a few transfers across many lines, went to extinction. There was a population collapse across many lines. By contrast, some of the mutants were able to withstand this alternating lifestyle, and some of them never went to extinction. And we couldn't figure out why this must be the case. And the first thought was that because the growth rate of these organisms is known to be lower when you shift from depleted to excess sulfate conditions, maybe the methanogen is getting titrated out. Turns out that was not the explanation. The relative amounts of the two cell types did not change across all the transfers. But then we looked at gene expression changes, and what we saw was within a couple of transfers going from syntrophy to sulfate respiration and back to syntrophy, the mutant stopped responding to the environmental changes, and it was not regulating genes as it was going from one lifestyle to another. By contrast, the wild type was repressing a large number of genes, nearly twice the number of genes across the entire experiment as compared to the mutant. Okay? And many of these genes, nearly all of those genes, were found to be essential for sulfate respiration. So we built a simple model to see what would happen if you have regulation or if you don't have regulation in a condition-dependent manner. And what you see is that the wild type very quickly goes, the enzymes required for sulfate respiration lifestyle get titrated out, and we suspect there's a baseline, and when the levels per cell drop below that baseline, these organisms experience a population collapse and go to extinction. And the leaky expression in the mutant is able to generate enough enzymes even during syntrophic phase when they're not required and sustain this behavior. To check that, we then went to look, we measured hydrogen evolution, which is a reflection of the physiology of the sulfate-reducing bacteria. And what we found was in the wild type, you see that hydrogen evolution drops, and after some point, it can no longer sustain sulfate respiration, whereas in the mutant, it drops, but it comes down to a steady state, which is above the baseline. So it can generate enough energy each time it is transferred to a sulfate respiration condition and support growth. And if you look at all the replicates in terms of the individual fitness patterns across the experiment, you see that the wild type, as the levels get low, they reach a high degree of variation in the population. And because we have a bottleneck when we transfer the cells, depending on the composition of the cells that are transferred to the next condition, they start collapsing at different times. But within about 6 or 7 transfers, the entire set of lines that we were evolving approached a population collapse, suggesting that a simple mutation, a single loss of function mutation in the regulatory network was able to sustain facultative syntrophic lifestyle in this organism. So I'll summarize very quickly all the points I made. The main point I want to convey is that the history of environmental structure has a big role to play in how organisms will adapt to changing environmental conditions. Okay? And the structure of the environment has shaped the networks, the architecture and dynamics of networks at a molecular level and at a cellular level. So they coordinate physiology within an organism and across organisms. Okay? And this memory of environmental history also defines the niche breadth of an organism, as I showed you with the diatom. And when you relax the constraints, sometimes a niche can broaden and can displace other organisms. However, simple mutations can generate complex behaviors, and I showed you with the yeast experiment that you can have novel adaptive prediction evolve quite rapidly within about 50 generations. When the cells were conditioned with caffeine, they anticipated a toxic stress. And in case of the two-organism synthetic community, disrupting the regulatory network sustained the facultative syntrophic behavior across the two organisms and prevented population collapse. One thing I didn't tell you is because the environment is so structured, we can exploit it to study the biology of these organisms. And what we've done here in many different organisms is subjected the organism to defined environmental stressors and looked at its molecular consequences genome-wide, and reverse engineered from that a network that can make predictions of responses to completely new environmental changes, because the change in the environment that we probed is linked to the change that was included as part of the new experiments. So with that, I'll thank several people here. It's a multidisciplinary group here, and different teams worked on the different projects that I shared with you today. Kenya did the anticipatory work on Halobacterium, along with Lee and Monica, who looked at the Dunaliella and Halobacterium interaction. The ocean acidification study was done in collaboration with Ginger Armbrust at the university and spearheaded along with Monica. And there are several postdocs and graduate students involved in this project. Justin is looking at cross-species responses to ocean acidification. Jake did the experiment on the niche broadening because of ocean acidification, and Gwen looked at the consequence of increased CO2 levels on carbon concentrating mechanisms. The adaptive prediction work was done by Adrian and Deep in collaboration with Jennifer and John, who's my colleague here. And the facultative syntrophy work is supported by a DOE grant from called Enigma. It's a large project, and we're collaborating with David Stow as part of that project, and several people, especially Sardar, I'd like to acknowledge as being critical in driving that, and Arjun did the modeling. So with that, I'll stop, and I don't know if I have time for one or two questions.
So we do have time for one question, if anyone has one. Here we go. No? No, okay, no. Yes, George?
How did you separate out?
Do you want to use the mic?
So in the environmental prediction part, adaptive prediction, how did you separate out simple selection from prediction?
I think what is happening is probably simple selection of mutants that have that kind of behavior. And it remains to be found out whether there's one or many different mechanisms that can link the caffeine response network to the FOA stress response mechanism.
Yeah, thanks, Nitin, for a great talk. And it's amazing how plastic these organisms are. So my question is, to what extent do you think our perception that these organisms are very plastic is determined by our choice of what to study? In other words, if we looked across a spectrum of cells, would we find that some respond well and others can't do it?
I think the plasticity is a function of the environments they've evolved in. So if there has been natural fluctuation in the environment during the evolution, they would have internalized those fluctuations to evolve plastic behaviors that allow them to deal with those, I would say, predictable changes. So I think that's what Dustin was referring to, is that when you don't have predictable variation, then you have some kind of bet hedging mechanism that arises that allows them to hedge some bet that the environment is going to change in an unpredictable way. And leaky expression could be one. There's a penalty for doing that. So if you expend energy to anticipate something that doesn't happen, then you are essentially at a disadvantage. So it depends on the structure of the environment.
Right, put your hands together for Nitin. Thank you.